Okay, coming from you live from my back deck because it's the only place I can get away from my family long enough to do anything. So, all right, it's been a while, but getting back into our material in preparation for class next week. So we're in chapter 8, and I'm not going to lie, guys. Chapter 8, chapter 10, they're about contracts, and contracts are pretty darn boring. So I can't even really make them that exciting, but I'll try to go as fast and keep it as simple as possible because it's just not fun material to cover. But they're a part of life. You've probably signed one before. If you haven't, you're going to sign several in your life. So as most of you know, I primarily do real estate law, so I'll probably make a lot of references to a real estate contract. It's something that will be applicable to all of you if it's not already, either because you've rented something or you've bought a house, you've sold a house, something like that. It's just an easy example for me to give. So a contract, what is a contract? It's a set of promises constituting an agreement between parties, giving each a legal duty to the other and the right to seek a remedy for the breach of the promises or duties. We're going to unpack all of that. A set of promises constituting an agreement, giving each a legal duty to the other and the right to seek a remedy if you breach them. So I'm going to use a real estate contract as an example. And the main reason for your purposes, especially as business students, that contracts are so important is they're important, and your book points this out, so that we can ensure a stable economy, so that we can ensure when people contract for goods or they contract for the sale of a house or items or whatnot, that we can keep the economy going based on those agreements. And so we don't just have a bunch of products being produced and then not purchased when they thought they were going to be. Houses being sold, products being sold, all kinds of stuff. It's all in line with commerce and making sure that that promises and agreements can be enforced so that we can keep prices down, keep production high, all those good things. So requirements of a valid contract. Number 1, you have to have an agreement. All right, you have to have all 4 of these things. First off is an agreement, meaning the offerer, that's the person making the offer, must offer to enter into an agreement, and the offeree must accept the terms of the offer. So you have to have an agreement between the parties. Somebody makes an offer. I offer to buy your house for $100,000, and you accept my offer. We have an agreement. That's the first step of a valid contract. Number 2, and this is a hard concept to grasp, but I think it'll be easy when we talk about a real estate contract. Number 2 is consideration. Consideration. It is something of value given or promised to convince another party to make the deal. So consideration, it's something of value. If I offer to buy your house for $100,000 and you accept that offer, the consideration is the $100,000. I'm giving you $100,000 in exchange for you giving me your house. All right? That's the value that's being bargained for and exchanged between the two of us. That's the consideration. There has to be something given up in exchange for something else for it to be a valid contract. Number 3, contractual capacity. Contractual capacity. Meaning both parties must be legally competent to enter into the agreement. All right? You have to have contractual capacity, meaning both sides are legally competent to enter into the agreement. There's no there's no mental disabilities. There's no concerns with somebody's age. They have to have known what they were doing at the time they signed the contract. Was that person suffering from Alzheimer's? Were they mentally disabled? Was there something where they couldn't understand the agreement that they were entering into? If that's the case, you may be able to invalidate that contract. And number 4, So you've got the agreement, consideration, contractual capacity, meaning everybody is legally competent to enter into the agreement. And number 4, legality. Legality, legality. The contract's purpose must be to accomplish some goal that is legal and not against public policy. All right, so what you're bargaining for and exchanging, it has to be legal before the court's going to enforce your contract. So make sure it's not something that you're doing that's illegal, because they're probably not going to care to enforce your contract. So make sure it's legal. So you have to have all 4 of those requirements before the contract is considered valid and therefore can be enforced by the court if somebody tries to not follow through with what they're supposed to do. All right, defenses to the enforceability of a contract. We're going to talk about a couple of them. So what this means is you've got a contract, but you're trying to get out of it. And here's a couple of different ways that you can. So number 1, there had to have been voluntary consent. Voluntary consent. So, and it's, the definition's pretty simple there. The consent of both parties must be voluntary. So basically, the contract, and I explain this here in the outline, the contract cannot be formed as a result of, for example, fraud or duress. And we've talked about this whenever we talked about in previous chapters where you've got certain defenses. And I think we talked about them in the criminal chapter. But with fraud or duress, obviously, if somebody can prove that their signature was forged on the contract, that's not my signature, or that they were under duress whenever they signed it, then they can make a valid argument to the court that even though this contract appears to be a valid contract, it was signed either fraudulently or under duress, and therefore it shouldn't be enforced and should be invalidated. Number 2 is form. So the contract must be in whatever form the law requires. And an example really having to deal with real estate contracts is any time that you are going to enter into an agreement dealing with real estate, you have to put it in writing before it's going to be valid. So a lot of times a contract can be formed orally. I agree to do this in exchange for you doing this. It's hard to prove the terms of our contract, but even though we never put it on paper, it's valid and the court can enforce it. However, there are some situations and some types of transactions that have to be in writing for it to be enforceable. And real estate contracts are one of those. So if there is some type of law that requires a certain form for a contract to be enforceable, then you have to comply with those requirements before the contract will be enforceable. And an example with the real estate example that I was giving you, that's known as the statute of frauds. And that's nothing that you need to know, but just as an aside, it's under the statute of frauds that some contracts have to be in writing rather than oral for them to be enforceable. So again, don't forget, sometimes contracts are enforceable and all we had was an oral agreement. Again, harder to prove the terms, but still enforceable by the court. Unless the statute of frauds requires, because it's a certain type of transaction, that it be in writing. Okay, moving on to contract types. We're going to talk about these 3 and then I'll take a break and start the next video. So contract types. The first distinction is a bilateral contract from a unilateral contract. Bilateral versus unilateral. So first up is bilateral. That's the first blank there on point A. This arises when the offerer gives her promise in exchange for the offeree's return promise. Let me unpack that. So bilateral contract means I promise to give you something in exchange for you promising to give me something. This is a real estate contract. I promise to give you $100,000 in exchange for you promising to give me your house. We're each giving up something. We're each making a promise to each other in exchange for the other's promise. Okay, that's a bilateral contract. We're both making a promise. As opposed to point B, a unilateral contract. This arises when the person can only accept by performance. All right, and I'm going to unpack that. A unilateral contract, it arises when the person can only accept the offer by performing. Have you ever seen a lost dog poster? And there is one all over Paducah of this golden retriever. Looks adorable. I sure hope they have found that dog because they have been trying so hard. But they have made a promise. They've made an offer to give, I don't remember if it was $500, $1,000. They've offered $1,000, say, to anybody who can bring their dog back. Okay, so I can't go to them and say, okay, you promised to give me $1,000 in exchange for me promising to bring your dog back. No, the only way I can get that $1,000 that they've offered is to perform and actually bring the dog back, not make them a promise to bring the dog back. Okay, that's a unilateral contract. Another example, a lottery ticket. They offer to pay you in exchange for you redeeming an actual winning ticket. I can't say, okay, in exchange for that, I promise to do. No. You have to act in order to be able to accept the offer that's been made to you. So another point under the unilateral contract, once the offeree, the person who it's been offered to, begins to perform, then the person who made the offer is going to lose their ability to revoke that offer. Okay, so if I start acting on it, if I start bringing you that dog, then you can no longer revoke that offer. I've already started to perform to bring you the dog back in exchange for the offer of the reward. And so at that point, you've lost the ability to revoke that offer that you've made to me. Okay, bilateral versus unilateral. Another distinction that we make with contracts is formal versus informal. And I kind of already touched on this, but point A, formal. This requires a special form or a method of formation in order to be enforceable. So remember those contracts I told you that sometimes have to be in writing? That's a formal contract. There's special forms, there's special requirements for some contracts to be enforceable. That's formal contract. Okay, an informal contract, point B, informal, does not require a specified form or method of formation in order to be valid. So there's a lot of contracts, if the law doesn't say otherwise, then a contract is informal but enforceable, even if it doesn't meet any special form or any special requirements about being in writing, anything like that. As long as it meets those 4 requirements to be a valid contract, and there's no other special requirements that it be in writing or anything like that, it's an informal contract, but it's still enforceable by the court. So you've got formal that has special requirements, and the law will tell you what situations require, certain forms. Otherwise, it's an informal contract, and as long as you've got agreement, consideration, everybody has contractual capacity, and it's a legal contract, then even though it's informal and has no special requirements, it's still enforceable. And lastly, number 3, express versus implied. All right, point A is express. This is a contract in which the terms of the agreement are explicitly stated, orally or in writing. So the terms of an express contract are explicitly stated. In a real estate contract, I offer to sell you, or I offer to buy your house for $100,000. You promise to give me that in exchange for the $100,000. Here's the property address. We'll close by this date. All the terms are written in that agreement. So it's an express agreement. All of them are explicitly stated in the contract. As opposed to point B, implied. This is a contract formed in whole or in part by your conduct. An implied contract. Example, you drop off your dry cleaning. Okay, well, when you go back to pick it up, they have furnished a service and they're expecting to be paid. So you didn't necessarily sit there and sign an agreement. You go to get your oil changed, hand them your car keys, they pull your car in. They furnished a service, they expect to be paid. This is the conduct. This is how that type of service works, where they perform a service for you and then expect to be paid afterwards. So you don't necessarily sit down before and sign an express agreement. It's an implied contract based more on the conduct and the type of service that you've got. So based on that conduct, they're expecting to be paid. So the terms of the agreement are implied based on the party's conduct, but still just as enforceable as an express contract that has all the terms outlined and explicitly stated. All right, so we'll pick up on the next part in the second video.